Yeah, so I'm gonna continue reading. I have 40%, so I'm gonna just see how far it takes me. All right. Chapter 3 of part 2, the prayers of the saints. Part 3 is Elizabeth's prayer. Lord, I wish I had have died in Egypt land. While Elisha was speaking, Elizabeth felt that the Lord was speaking a message to her heart, that this fiery visitation was meant for her, and that if she humbled herself to listen, God would give her the interpretation. The certainty did not fill her with exaltation, but with fear. She was afraid of what God might say, or what displeasure, what condemnation, what prophecies of trials yet to be endured might issue from his mouth. Now Elisha ceased to speak and rose. Now he sat at the piano. There was muted singing all around her, yet she waited. Before her mind's eyes wavered in a light like the light from a fire, the face of John, whom she had brought so unwillingly into the world. It was for this deliverance that she wept tonight, that he might be carried past wrath unspeakable into a state of grace. They were singing, "Must Jesus bear the cross alone, and all the world go free?" Elisha picked out the song on the piano, his fingers seeming to hesitate, almost to be unwilling. She too strained against her great unwillingness, but forced her heart to say amen as the voice of praying Mother Washington picked up the response. No, there's a cross for everyone, and there's a cross for me. She heard weeping near her. Was it Alame or Florence, or the echo magnified of her own tears? The weeping was buried beneath the song. She had been hearing the song all her life. She had grown up with it, but she had never understood it as well as she understood it now. It filled the church as though the church had merely become a hollow or a void, echoing with the voices that had driven her to this dark place. Her aunt had sung it always her aunt had sung it always harshly under her breath in a bitter pride. The consecrated cross I'll bear till death shall set me free, and then go home, a crown to wear, for there's a crown for me. She was probably an old woman now, still in the same harshness of spirit, singing the song in the tiny house down home, which she and Elizabeth had shared so long, and she did not know of Elizabeth's shame. Elizabeth had not written about John until long after she was married to Gabriel. And the Lord had never allowed her aunt to come to New York City. Her aunt had always prophesied that Elizabeth would come to no good end, proud and vain and foolish as she was, and having been allowed to run wild all her childhood days. Her aunt had come second in the series of disasters that had ended Elizabeth's childhood. First, when she was 8, going on 9, her mother had died, an event not immediately recognized by Elizabeth as a disaster, since she had scarcely known her mother and had certainly never loved her. Her mother had been very fair and beautiful and delicate of health, so that she stayed in bed most of the time, reading spiritualist pamphlets concerning the benefits of disease and complaining to Elizabeth's father of how she suffered. Elizabeth remembered of her only that she wept very easily and that she smelled like stale milk. It was perhaps her mother's disquieting color that, whenever she was held in her mother's arms, made Elizabeth think of milk. Her mother did not, however, hold Elizabeth in her arms very often. Elizabeth very quickly suspected that this was because she was so very much darker than her mother, and not nearly, of course, so beautiful. When she faced her mother, she was shy, downcast, sullen. She did not know how to answer her mother's shrill, meaningless questions, put with the furious affectation of maternal concern. She could not pretend when she kissed her mother or submitted to her mother's kiss that she was moved by anything more than an unpleasant sense of duty. This, of course, bred in her mother a kind of baffled fury, and she never tired of telling Elizabeth that she was an unnatural child. But it was very different with her father. He was, and so Elizabeth never failed to think of him young and handsome and kind and generous, and he loved his daughter. He told her that she was the apple of his eye, that she was wound around his heartstrings, that she was surely the finest little lady in the land. When she was with her father, she pranced and postured like a queen, and she was not afraid of anything save the moment when he would say that it was her bedtime or that he had to be getting along. He was always buying her things. Things to wear and things to play with, and taking her on Sundays for long walks through the country, or to the circus when the circus was in town, or to Punch and Judy shows. And he was dark like Elizabeth and gentle and proud. He had never been angry with her, but she had seen him angry a few times with other people, her mother, for example, and later, of course, her aunt. Her mother was always angry, and Elizabeth paid no attention, and later her aunt was perpetually angry, and Elizabeth learned to bear it. But if her father had ever been angry with her in those days, she would have wanted to die. Neither had he ever learned of her disgrace when it happened. She could not think how to tell him how to bring such pain to him who had such pain already. Later, when she would have to hold him, he was long past carrying in the silent ground. She thought of him now while the singing and weeping went on around her, and she thought how he would have loved his grandson, who was like him in so many ways. Perhaps she dreamed it, but she did not believe she dreamed when at the moment she thought she heard in John's echoes, curiously distant and distorted, of her father's gentleness and the trick of his laugh. how he threw his head back and the years that marked his face fled away and the soft eyes softened and the mouth turned upward at the corners like a little boy's mouth, and that deadly pride of her father's behind which she retired when confronted by the nastiness of other people was he who had told her to weep when she wept alone, never to let the world see, never to ask for mercy if one had to die, to go ahead and die, but never to let oneself be beaten. He had said this to her on one of the last times she had seen him when she was being carried miles away to Maryland to live with her aunt. She had reason in the years that followed to remember his saying this, and time at last to discover in herself the depths of bitterness in her father from which these words had come. For when her mother died, the world fell down. Her aunt, her mother's older sister, arrived and stood appalled at Elizabeth's vanity and uselessness, and decided immediately that her father was no fit person to raise a child, especially, as she darkly said, an innocent little girl. And it was this decision on the part of the aunt, for which Elizabeth did not forgive her for many years, that precipitated the third disaster, the separation of herself from her father, from all that she loved on earth. For her father ran what her aunt called a house, not the house where they lived, but another house, to which, as Elizabeth gathered, wicked people often came, and he had also, to Elizabeth's rather horrified confusion, a stable. Low common N-words, the lowest of the low, came from all over and sometimes brought their women and sometimes found them there to eat and drink cheap moonshine and play music all night long and to do worse things. Her aunt's dreadful silence then suggested, which were far better left unsaid, and she swore, move heaven and earth before she would let her sister's daughter grow up with such a man, without, however, so much as looking at heaven, and without troubling any more of the earth than that part of it which held the courthouse. She won the day, like a clap of thunder or like a magic spell, like light one moment and darkness the next. Elizabeth's life had changed. Her mother was dead, her father banished, and she lived in the shadow of her aunt. Or more exactly, as she thought now, the shadow in which she had always lived was fear, fear made more dense by hatred. Not for a moment had she judged her father. It would have made no difference to her love for him had she been told and even seen it proved that he was first cousin to the devil. The proof would not have existed for her, and if it had, she would not have regretted being his daughter or have asked for anything better than to suffer at his sight in hell. And when she had been taken from him, her imagination had been wholly unable to lend reality to the wickedness of which he stood accused. She certainly did not accuse him. She screamed in anguish when he put her from him and turned to go, and she had to be carried to the train. And later, when she understood perfectly all that happened then, still in her heart she could not accuse him. Perhaps his life had been wicked, but he had been very good to her. His life had certainly cost him enough in pain to make the world's judgment a thing of no account. They had not known him as she had known him. They did not care as she had cared. It only made her sad that he never, as he had promised, came to take her away, and that while she was growing up, she saw him so seldom. When she became a young woman, she did not see him at all, but that was her own fault. No, she did not accuse him, but she accused her aunt, and this from the moment she understood that her aunt had loved her mother, but did not love him. This could only mean that her aunt could not love her either, and nothing in her life with her aunt ever proved Elizabeth wrong. It was true that her aunt was always talking of how much she loved her sister's daughter, and what great sacrifices she had made on her account, and what great care she took to see to it that Elizabeth should grow up a good Christian girl. But Elizabeth was not for a moment fooled, and did not for as long as she lived with her failed to despise her aunt. She sensed that what her aunt spoke of as love was something else, a bribe, a threat, an indecent will to power. She knew that the kind of imprisonment that love might impose was also mysteriously a freedom for the soul and spirit, was water in the dry place. It had nothing to do with the prisons, churches, laws, rewards, and punishments that so positively cluttered the landscape of her aunt's mind. And yet tonight, in her great confusion, she wondered if she had not been wrong, if there had not been something that she had overlooked, for which the Lord had made her suffer. "You little Miss Great I Am," her aunt had said to her in those days. "You better watch your step, you hear me? You go walking around with your nose in the air, the Lord's going to let you fall right on down to see the bottom of the ground. You mark my words, you'll see." To this perpetual accusation, Elizabeth had never replied. She merely regarded her aunt with a wide-eyed, insolent stare, meant at once to register her disdain and to thwart any pretext for punishment. And this stroke, which she had unconsciously picked up from her father, rarely failed to work. As the years went on, her aunt seemed to gouge in a look the icy distances that Elizabeth had put between them, and that would certainly never be conquered now. And she would add, looking down and under her breath, "Because God don't like it. I sure don't care what God don't like, or you either," Elizabeth's heart replied. "I'm going away from here. He's going to come and get me, and I'm going away from here." He was her father who never came. As the years passed, she replied, "I'm going away from here." And it hung, this determination, like a heavy jewel between her breasts. It was written in fire on dark It was written in fire on the dark sky of her mind. That makes me think about my daughter. But yes, there was something she had overlooked. Pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. She had not known this. She had not imagined that she could fall. She wondered tonight how she could give this knowledge to her son, if she could help him to endure what could no longer be changed. If while life ran, he would forgive her for her pride, her folly, and her bargaining with God. For tonight, those years before her fall in her aunt's dark house, the house which smelled always of clothes kept too long in closets, and of old women, which was redolent of their gossip, and was pervaded somehow by the odor of the lemon her aunt took in her tea, and by the odor of frying fish, and of the still that someone kept in the basement, came before him entire and overwhelming. And she remembered herself entering any room in which her aunt might be sitting, responding to anything her aunt might say, standing before her as rigid as metal and cancerous with hate and fear, in battle every hour of every day, a battle that she continued in her dream. She knew now of what it was that she had so silently and so early accused her aunt. It was of tearing a bewildered child away from the arms of the father she loved. And she knew now she had sometimes so dimly and so unwillingly felt that her father had betrayed her. It was because he had not overturned the earth to take his daughter away from a woman who did not love her and whom she did not love. And she knew tonight how difficult it was to overturn the earth, for she had tried once and she had failed, and she knew too, and it made the tears that touched her mouth more bitter than the most bitter herb, that without the pride and bitterness she had no longer carried in her heart against her aunt, she could never endured her life with her. And she thought of Richard. It was Richard who had taken her out of that house and out of the south and into the city of destruction. He had suddenly arrived, and from the moment he arrived until the moment of his death, he had filled her life. Not even tonight, in his heart's nearly impenetrable secret place where the truth is hidden and where only the truth can live, could she wish that she had not known him or denied. So as long as he was there, the rejoicing of heaven could have meant nothing to her. That being forced to choose between Richard and God, she could only, even in weeping, have turned away from God. And this was why God had taken him from her. It was for all of this that she was paying now. And it was this pride, hatred, and bitterness, lust, this folly, this corruption of which her son was the heir. Richard had not been born in Maryland, but he was working there. The summer that she met him as a grocery clerk, it was 1919, and she was 1 year younger than the century. He was 22, which seemed a great age to her in those days. She noticed him at once because he was so sullen, only barely polite. He waited on folks, her aunt said furiously, as though he hoped the food they bought would poison them. Elizabeth liked to watch him move. His body was very thin and beautiful, nervous, high-strung, thought Elizabeth wisely. He moved exactly like a cat, perpetually on the balls of his feet, and with the cat's impressive, indifferent aloofness, his face closed and his eyes no light at all. He smoked all the time, a cigarette between his lips as he added up the figures and sometimes left burning on the counter while he went to look for stock. When, as someone entered, he said good morning or good day, he said it barely looking up and with an indifference that fell just short of insolence. When, having bought what he wanted and counted his change, the customer turned to leave, and Richard said thank you. It sounded so much like a curse that people sometimes turned in surprise to stare. He sure don't like working in that store, Elizabeth once observed to her aunt. He don't like working, said her aunt scornfully. He just like you. On a bright summer day, bright in her memory forever, she came into the store alone, wearing her best white summer dress and with her hair newly straightened and curled at the ends, tied with a scarlet ribbon. She was going to a great church picnic with her aunt and had come in to buy some lemons. She passed the owner of the store, who was a very fat man sitting out on the sidewalk, fanning himself. He asked her as she passed if it was hot enough for her, and she asked something and walked into the dark, heavy-smelling store where flies buzzed and where Richard sat on the counter reading a book. She felt immediately guilty about having disturbed him and muttered apologetically that she only wanted to buy some lemons. She expected him to get them for her in his sullen fashion and go back to his book, but he smiled and said, "Is that all you want? You better think now. You sure ain't forgot nothing?" She had never seen him smile before, nor had she really, for that matter, ever heard his voice. Her heart gave a dreadful leap, and then, as dreadfully, seemed to have stopped forever. She could only stand there staring at him. If he had asked her to repeat what she wanted, she could not possibly have remembered what it was. And she found that she was looking into his eyes, and where she had thought there was no light at all, she found a light she had never seen before, and he was smiling still, but there was something curiously urgent in his smile. Then he said, "How many lemons, little girl?" "6," she said at last, and discovered to her vast relief that nothing had happened. The sun was still shining. The fat man still sat at the door. Her heart was beating as though it had never stopped. She was not, however, fooled. She remembered the instant at which her heart had stopped, and she knew that beat now with the difference. He put the lemons into a bag, and with a curious difference, she came closer to the counter to give him the money. She was in a terrible state, for she found that she could neither take her eyes off him nor look at him. "Is that your mother you come in with all the time?" he asked. "No," she said, "that's my aunt." She didn't know why she said it, but she said, "My mother's dead." "Oh," he said. Then, "Mine too." They both looked thoughtfully at the money on the counter. He picked it up but did not move. "I don't think it was your mother," he said finally. I didn't think it was your mother, he said finally. Why? I don't know. She don't look like you. He started to light a cigarette and then looked at her and put the pack in his pocket again. Don't mind me, she said quickly. Anyway, I got to go. She's waiting. We going out. He turned and banged the cash register. She picked up her lemons. He gave her change. She felt that she ought to say something. It didn't seem right somehow just to walk out, but she could not think of anything. But he said, and that's why you so dressed up today. Where are you going to? We're going to a picnic, a church picnic, she said, and suddenly, unaccountably, and for the first time, smiled. And he smiled too and lit a cigarette, blowing the smoke carefully away from her. You like picnics? Sometimes, she said. She was not comfortable with him yet, and still she was beginning to feel that she would like to stand and talk to him all day. She wanted to ask him what he was reading, but she did not dare yet. What's your name? She abruptly brought out. Richard, he said. Oh, she said thoughtfully. Then, mine's Elizabeth. I know, he said. I heard her call you one time. Well, she said helplessly after a long pause. Goodbye. Goodbye, you ain't going away, is you? Oh no, she said in confusion. Well, he said and smiled, bowed. Good day. Yes, she said, good day. As she turned and walked onto the streets, not the same streets from which she had entered a moment ago. These streets, the sky above, the sun, the drifting people, all had in a moment changed and would never be the same again. You remember that day, he asked much later, when he come into the store? Yes. Well, you was mighty pretty. I didn't think you never looked at me. Well, I didn't think you never looked at me. You was reading a book. Yes. What book was it, Richard? Well, I don't remember, just a book. You smiled. You did too. No, I didn't. I remember. Yes, you did. No, I didn't. Not till you did. Well, anyway, you was pretty, mighty pretty. She did not like to think of with what hardness of heart, what calculated weeping, what deceit, what cruelty she now went into battle with her aunt for her freedom. She wanted, even though uncertain, not to be dismissed conditions. The principal condition was that she would put herself under the protection of a distant, unspeakably respectful female relative of her aunt's who lived in New York City. For when the summer ended, Richard said that he was going there and that he wanted her to come with him. They would get married there. Richard said that he hated the South, and this was perhaps the reason it did not occur to either of them to begin their married life there. And Elizabeth was checked by the fear that if her aunt should discover how things stood between her and Richard, she would find, as she had found so many years before in the case of her father, some means of bringing about their separation. This, as Elizabeth later considered, was the first in a sordid series of mistakes which was to cause her to fall so low. But to look back from the stony plain along the road which led one to that place is not at all the same thing as walking on the road. The perspective, to say the very least, changes only with the journey. Only when the road has, all abruptly and treacherously and with an absoluteness that permits no argument, turned or dropped or risen, is one able to see all the one could have or could not have seen from any other place. Okay, what do you say? But to look back from the stony plain along the road which led one to the place is not at all the same thing as walking on the road. The perspective, to say the very least, changes only with the journey. Only when the road has, all abruptly and treacherously, and with an absoluteness that permits no argument, turned or dropped or risen, is one able to see all that one could not have seen from any other place. In those days, had the Lord himself descended from heaven with trumpets telling her to turn back, she could scarcely have heard him, and could certainly not have heeded. She lived in those days in a fiery storm of which Richard was the center and the heart, and she fought only to reach him, only that she was afraid only of what might happen if they were kept from one another, for what might come after she had no thoughts or fears to spare. Her pretext for coming to New York was to take advantage of the greater opportunities the North offered colored people, to study in a northern school and to find a better job than any she was likely to be offered in the South. Her aunt, who listened to this was no diminution of her habitual scorn, was yet unable to deny that from generation to generation things, as she grudgingly put it, were bound to change, and neither could she quite take the position of seeming to stand in Elizabeth's way. In the winter of 1920, as the year began, Elizabeth found herself in an ugly back room in Harlem in the home of her aunt's relative, a woman whose respectability was immediately evident from the incense she burned in her rooms and the spiritualist seances she held every Saturday night. The house was still standing, not very far away. Often she was forced to pass it without looking up. She was able to see the windows of the apartment in which she had lived, and the woman's sign was in the window, Madame Williams, spiritualist. She found a job as a chambermaid in the same hotel in which Richard worked as an elevator boy. Richard said that they would marry as soon as he had saved some money, but since he was going to school at night and made very little money, their marriage, which she had thought of as taking place almost as soon as she arrived, was planned for a future that grew ever more remote. And this presented her with the problem that she had refused at home in Maryland to think about, but from which now she could not escape. The problem of their life together, reality so to speak, burst in for the first time on her great dreaming, and she found occasion to wonder ruefully what had made her imagine that once with Richard she would have been able to withstand him. She had kept precariously enough what her aunt referred to as her pearl without price while she had been with Richard down home. This, which she had taken as witness to her own feminine moral strength, had been due to nothing more. It now developed than a great fear of her aunt and the lack in that small town of opportunity. Here in this great city, no one cared, where people might live in the same building for years and never speak to one another. She found herself when Richard took her in his arms on the edge of a steep place, and down she rushed on the descent uncaring into the dreadful sea. So it began, had it been waiting for her since the day she had been taken from her father's arms. The world in which she now found herself was not unlike the world from which she had so long ago been rescued. Here were the women who had been the cause of her aunt's most passionate condemnation of her father, hard drinking, hard talking, with whiskey and cigarette breath, and moving with the mystic authority of women who knew what sweet violence might be acted out under the moon and stars or beneath the tigerish lights of the city, in the raucous hay or the singing bed. And was she, Elizabeth, so sweetly fallen, so tightly chained, one of these women now? And here were the men who had come day and night to visit her father's stable with their sweet talk and their music and their violence and their sex, black, brown, and beige, who looked on her with lewd and lustful and laughing eyes. And these were Richard's friends. Not one of them ever went to church one night, scarcely have imagined that they knew that churches existed. They all outwardly, daily, in their speech, in their lives, and in their hearts, cursed God. They all seemed to be saying, as Richard, when the once timidly mentioned the love of Jesus, said, "You can tell that puking bastard kissed my big black ass." She, for very terror on hearing this, had wept. She could not deny that for such an abundance of bitterness as there was a positive fountain of grief. There was not, after all, a great difference between the world of the North and that of the South, which she had fled. There was only this difference: the North promised more, and this similarity, what it promised, it did not give, and what it gave at length and grudgingly with one hand, it took back with the other. Now she understood in this nervousness, hollow, ringing city, that nervousness of Richard's, which had so attracted her attention, so total and so without the hope or possibility of release or resolution, that she felt it in her muscles and heard it in his breathing, even as on her breast he fell asleep. And this was perhaps why she had never thought to leave him, frightened though she was during all that time, and in a world in which, had it not been for Richard, she could have found no place to put her feet. She did not leave him because he was afraid of what might happen to him without her. She was afraid. She did not resist him because he needed her. And she did not press about marriage because, upset as he was about everything, she was afraid of having him upset about her too. She thought of herself as his strength in a world of shadows, the indisputable reality to which he could always repair. And again, for all that had come, she could not regret this. She had tried, but she had never been, and was not now, even tonight, truly sorry. Where then was her repentance, and how could God hear her cry? They had been very happy together in the beginning. Until the very end, he had been very good to her, had not ceased to love her, and tried always to make her know it. No more than she had been able to accuse her father had she ever been able to accuse him. His weakness she understood, and his terror, and even his bloody end, what life had made him bear, her lover. This wild, unhappy, many another stronger, this wild, unhappy boy, many another stronger and more virtuous man might not have borne so well. Saturday was their best day, for they only worked until 1 o'clock. They had all the afternoon to be together, and nearly all of the night, since Madame Williams had her seances on Saturday night and preferred that Elizabeth, before whose silent skepticism departed spirits might find themselves reluctant to speak, should not be in the house. They met at the service entrance. Richard was always there before her, looking oddly much younger and less anonymous without the ugly, tight-fitting black uniform that he had to wear when working. He would be talking or laughing with some of the other boys or shooting craps, and when he heard her step down the long stone hall, he would look up, laughing, and wickedly nudging one of the other boys. He would half shout, half sing, "Hey, look up there, ain't she pretty?" And she never failed at this, which was why he never failed to do it, to blush, half smiling, half frowning, and nervously to touch the collar of her dress. "Sweet Georgia Brown," somebody might say. "Miss Brown to you," said Richard then, and took her arm. "Yeah, that's right," somebody else would say. "You better hold on to little Miss Bright Eyes. Don't somebody sure go take her away from you." "Yeah," said another voice, "and it might be me." "Oh no," said Richard, moving with her towards the street. "Ain't nobody going to take my little bit away from me." Little Bit. It had been his name for her, and sometimes he called her Sandwich Mouth or Funny Face or Frog Eyes. She would not, of course, have endured these names from anyone else, nor had she not found herself with joy and helplessness in a sleeping panic, living it out would she ever have suffered herself so publicly to become a man's property, concubine, her aunt would have said, and at night alone she rolled the word, tart like lemon rind, on her tongue. She was descending with Richard to the sea. She would have to climb back up alone, but she did not know this then. Leaving the boys in the hall, she gained the midtown New York streets. And what we're going to do today, little bit, with that smile of his and those deathless eyes, depthless, beneath the towers of the white city, with people white hurrying all around them. I don't know, honey, what you want to do? Or maybe we go to a museum. The first time he suggested this, she demanded in panic if they would be allowed to enter. Sure, they let N-words in, Richard said, and we got to be educated too. Ain't we got to be educated too, to live with the motherfuckers? He never watched his language with her, which at first she took as evidence of his contempt because she had fallen so easily, and which later she took as evidence of his love. And when he took her to the Museum of Natural History of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where they were almost certain to be the only black people, and he guided her through the halls, which never ceased in her imagination to be as cold as tombstones. It was as then she saw another life in him, and never ceased to frighten her, this passion he brought to something she cannot understand. For she never grasped, not at any rate with her mind, what, with such incandescence, he tried to tell her on these Saturday afternoons. She could not find between herself and the African statuette or totem pole on which he gazed with such melancholy wonder any point of contact. She was only glad that she did not look that way. She preferred to look in the other museum at the paintings, but still she did not understand anything he said about them. She did not know why he so adored things that were so long dead, what sustenance they gave him, what secrets he hoped to wrest from them. But she understood at least they did give him a kind of bitter nourishment, and that the secrets they held for him were a matter of his life and death. It frightened her because she felt that he was reaching for the moon and that he would therefore be dashed down against the rocks. But she did not say any of this. She only listened, and in her heart she prayed for him. But on the other Saturdays, they went to see a movie. They went to see a play. They visited his friends. They walked through Central Park. She liked the park because, however spuriously, it recreated something of the landscape she had known. How many afternoons had they walked there? She had always since avoided it. They brought peanuts and for hours fed the animals at the zoo. They brought soda pop and drank it on the grass. They walked along the reservoir, and Richard explained how a city like New York found water to drink. Mixed with her fear for him was a total admiration that he had learned so young. So much people stared at them, but she did not mind. He noticed, but he did not seem to notice. But sometimes he would ask in the middle of a sentence concerned possibly with ancient Rome, little bit, do you love me? And she wondered how he could doubt it. She thought how infirm she must be not to have been able to make sure him know it. And she raised her eyes to his, and she said the only thing she could say, I wish to God I may die if I don't love you. There ain't no sky above us if I don't love you. Then he would look ironically up at the sky and take her arm with a firmer pressure, and they would walk on. Once she asked him, Richard, did you go to school much when you was little? And he looked at her a long moment. Then, baby, I done told you, my mama died when I was born, and my daddy, he weren't nowhere to be found, and nobody ever took care of me. I just moved from place to another. When one set of folks got tired of me, they sent me down the line. I didn't hardly go to school at all. And how come you got to be so smart? How come you got to know so much? And he smiled, pleased, but he said, little bit, I don't know so much. Then he said with the change in his face and voice, which she had grown to know, I just decided one day that I was going to get to know everything them white bastards knew, and I was going to get to know it better than them, so could no white son of a bitch nowhere never talk me down and never make me feel like I was dirt when I could read him the alphabet, back, front, and sideways. Shit, he weren't going to be my ass then, and if he tried to kill me, I'd take him with me. I swear to my mother I would. Then he looked at her again and smiled and kissed her, and he said, that's how I got to know so much, baby. She asked, and what are you going to do, Richard? Where you want to be? And his face clouded. I don't know, I got to find out. Looks like I can't get my mind straight no how. She did not know why he couldn't, or she could only dimly face it, but she knew he spoke the truth. She had made her great mistake with Richard in not telling him that she was going to have a child. Perhaps she thought now, if she had told him, everything might have been very different, and he would be living yet. But the circumstances under which she had discovered herself to be pregnant had been such to make her decide for his sake to hold her peace a while. Frightened as she was, she dared not to add to the panic that overtook him on the last summer of his life. And yet perhaps it was after all this, or after this, yet perhaps it was after all this failure to demand of his strength, when it might then most miraculously have been found able to bear, by which indeed, how could she know? His strength might have been strengthened, for which she prayed tonight to be forgiven. Perhaps she had lost her love because she had not in the end believed in it enough. She lived quite a long way from Richard, 4 subway stops, and when it was time for her to go home, he always took the subway uptown with her and walked her to her door. On a Saturday when they had forgotten the time and stayed together later than usual, he left her at her door at 2 o'clock in the morning. They said goodnight. They said goodnight hurriedly, for she was afraid of trouble when she got upstairs, though in fact Madame Williams seemed astonishingly indifferent to the hours Elizabeth kept, and he wanted to hurry back home and go to bed. Yet as he hurried off down the dark, murmuring street, she had a sudden impulse to call him back, to ask him to take her with him and never let her go again. She hurried up the steps, smiling a little at this fancy. It was because he looked so young and defenseless as he walked away, yet so jaunty and strong. He was to come the next morning at supper time to make at last, at Elizabeth's urging, the acquaintance of Madame Williams, but he did not come. She drove Madame Williams wild with her sudden sensitivity to footsteps on the stairs. Having told Madame Williams that a gentleman was coming to visit her, she did not dare, of course, to leave the house and go out looking for him, thus giving Madame Williams the impression that she dragged men in off the streets. At 10 o'clock, having eaten no supper, a detail unnoticed by her hostess, she went to bed, her head aching and her heart sick with fear over what had happened to Richard, who had never kept her waiting before, and fear involving all that was beginning to happen in her body. And on Monday morning, she was not at work. She left during the lunch hour to go to his room. He was not there. His landlady said that he had not been there all weekend, while Elizabeth stood trembling and indecisive in the hall. 2 white policemen entered. She knew the moment she saw them, and before they mentioned his name, that something terrible had happened to Richard. Her heart, as on the bright summer day when he had first spoken to her, gave a terrible bound, and then was still. With an awful wounded stillness, she put out one hand to touch the wall in order to keep standing. "This here young lady was just looking for him," she said, heard the landlady say. They all looked at her. "You his girl?" one of the policemen asked. She looked up at his sweating face, on which a lascivious smile had immediately appeared, and straightened, trying to control her trembling. Oh yeah, my nose is running. I'm sorry. I'm not even noticing. Sorry guys. Yes, she said. "Where is he?" "He's in jail, honey," the other policeman said. "What for?" "For robbing a white man's store, black girl, that's what's for." She found and thanked heaven for it that a cold, stony rage had entered her. She would otherwise certainly have fallen down or begun to weep. She looked at the smiling policeman. "Richard ain't robbed no store," she said. "Tell me where he is, and I tell you," he said, not smiling, "that your boyfriend robbed the store and he's in jail for it. He's going to stay there too now. What you got to say to that? And he probably did it for you too," the other policeman said. "You look like a girl a man could rob a store for." She said nothing. He was thinking how to get to see him now, how to get to him, how to get him out. One of them, the smiler, turned now to the landlady and said, "Let's have the key to his room. How long he's been living here?" "About a year," the landlady said. She looked unhappily at Elizabeth. "He seemed like a real nice boy." "Ah, yes," he said, mounting the steps. "They all seem like real nice boys when they pay their rent." These fucking cops. I'm on page 200. I think I gotta go to... yeah, I'm going to page 224, so I have 24 pages left. "Ah, yes," he said, mounting the steps. "They all seem like real nice boys when they pay their rent." "You going to take me to see him?" she asked of the remaining policeman. She found herself fascinated by the gun in his holster, the club at his side. She wanted to take that pistol, empty it into his round, red face, to take that club and strike with all the strength against the base of his skull where his cap ended, until the ugly, silky white man's hair was matted with blood and brains. "Sure, girl," he said, "you're coming right along with us. The man at the station house wants to ask you some questions." The smiling policeman came down again. "Ain't nothing up there," he said. "Let's go." She moved between them out into the sun. She knew that there was nothing to be gained by talking to them anymore. She was entirely in their power. She would have to think faster than they could. She would have to contain her fear and her hatred and find out what could be done. Not for anything short of Richard's life, and not possibly even for that would she have wept before them or asked of them a kindness. A small crowd, children and curious passerbys, followed them as they walked the long, dusty, sunlit street. She hoped only that they would not pass anyone she knew. She kept her head high, looking straight ahead, and felt the skin settle over her bones as though she were wearing a mask. And at the station, she somehow got past her brutal laughter. "What was he doing with you, girl, until 2 o'clock in the morning? Next time you feel like that, girl, you come by here and talk to me." She felt that she was about to burst or vomit or die, though the sweat stood out cruelly like needles on her brow. As she felt herself from every side being covered with the stink and filth, she found out in their own good time what she wanted to know. He was being held in a prison downtown called the Tombs. The name made her heart turn over, and she could see him tomorrow. The state or the prison or someone had already assigned him a lawyer. He would be brought to trial next week. But the next day, when she saw him, she wept. He had been beaten, he whispered to her, and he could hardly walk. His body, she later discovered, bore almost no bruises, but was full of strange, painful swellings, and there was a welt above one eye. He had not, of course, robbed the store, but when he left her that Saturday, had gone down into the subway station to wait for his train. It was late and trains were slow, and he was all alone on the platform, only half awake, thinking he said of her. Then from the far end of the platform, he heard a sound of running, and looking up, he saw two colored boys come running down the steps. Their clothes were torn and they were frightened. They came up the platform and stood near, breathing hard. He was about to ask them what the trouble was when, running across the tracks toward them and followed by a white man, he saw another colored boy, and at that same instant, another white man came running down the subway steps. Then he came full awake in panic. He knew that whatever the trouble was, it was now his trouble also, for these white men would make no distinction between him and the three boys they were after. They were all colored, they were about the same age, and here they stood together on the subway platform, and they were all, with no questions asked, herded upstairs and into the wagon, into the station house. At the station, Richard gave his name and address and age and occupation, and for the first time he stated that he was not involved, and asked one of the other boys to corroborate his testimony. This they rather despairingly did. They might, Elizabeth felt, have done it sooner, but they probably also felt that it would be useless to speak, and they were not believed. The owner of the store was being brought there to make the identification, and Richard tried to relax. The man could not say that he had been there if he had never seen him before. But when the owner came, a short man with a bloody shirt, for they had knifed him, in the company of yet another policeman, he looked at the four boys before him and said, "Yeah, that's them, all right." Then Richard shouted, "But I wasn't there. Look at me, goddammit, I wasn't there." "You black bastards," the man said, looking at them. "You're all the same." Then there was silence in the station, the eyes of the white men all watching, and Richard said, but quietly, knowing that he was lost, "But all the same, mister, I wasn't there." And he looked at the white man's bloody shirt and thought, he told Elizabeth at the bottom of his heart, "I wish to God they'd killed you." Then the questioning began. The three boys signed a confession at once, but Richard would not sign. He said at last that he would die before he signed a confession to something he hadn't done. "Well then," said one of them, hitting him suddenly across his head, "maybe you will die, you black son of a bitch." And the beating began. He would not then talk to her about it. She found that, before the dread and the hatred that filled her mind, her imagination faltered and held its peace. "What are we going to do? What are we going to do?" she asked at last. He smiled a vicious smile. She had never seen such a smile on his face before. "Maybe you ought to pray to that Jesus of yours and get him to come down and tell these white men something." He looked at her a long, dying moment. "Because I don't know anything else to do," he said. She suggested, "Richard, what about another lawyer?" And he smiled again. "I declare," he said, "little bit's been holding out on me. She got a fortune tied up in a sock, and she ain't never told me anything about it. She had been trying to save money for a whole year, but she had only $30. She sat before him, going over in her mind all the things she might do to raise money, even going on the streets. Then, for very helplessness, she began to shake with sobbing. At this, his face became Richard's face again. He said in a shaking voice, "Now look here, little bit. Don't you be like that. We're going to work this out all right." But she could not stop sobbing. "Elizabeth," he whispered. "Elizabeth, Elizabeth." The man came and said that it was time for her to go. As she rose, she had brought 2 packs of cigarettes for him. They were still in her bag, wholly ignorant of prison regulations. She did not dare to give them to him under the man's eyes. And somehow, her failure to remember to give them the cigarettes when she knew how much he smoked made her weep the harder. She tried and failed to smile at him, and she was slowly led to the door. The sun nearly blinded her, and she heard him whisper behind her, "So long, baby, be good." In the streets, she did not know what to do. She stood a while before the dreadful gates, and then she walked and walked until she came to a coffee shop where taxi drivers and the people who worked in nearby offices hurried in. In and out all day. Usually she was afraid of going to downtown establishments where only white people were, but today she did not care. She felt that if anyone said anything to her, she would turn and curse him like the lowest bitch on the streets. If anyone touched her, she would do her best to send his soul to hell. But no one touched her. No one spoke. She drank her coffee, sitting in the strong sun that fell through the window. Now it came to her how alone, how frightened she was. She had never been so frightened in her life before. She knew that she was pregnant, knew it, as the old folks said, in her bones. And if Richard should be sent away, what under heaven could she do? 2 years, 3 years. She had no idea how long he might be sent away for. What would she do? And how could she keep her aunt from knowing? And if her aunt should find out, then her father would know too. The tears welled up, and she drank her cold, tasteless coffee. And what would they do with Richard? And if they sent him away, what would he be like then when he returned? She looked out into the quiet, sunny streets, and for the first time in her life, she hated it all. The white city, the white world. She could not, that day, think of one decent white person in the whole world. She sat there and she hoped that one day God, with tortures inconceivable, would grind them utterly into humility and make them know that black boys and black girls whom they treated with such condescension, such disdain, and such humor had hearts like human beings too, more human hearts than theirs. But Richard was not sent away. Against the testimony of the three robbers and her own testimony, and under oath, the storekeeper's indecision, there was no evidence on which to convict him. The courtroom seemed to feel with some complacency and some disappointment that it was his great good luck to be let off so easily. They went immediately to his room, and there she was never all her life long to forget it. He threw himself face downward on his bed and wept. She had only seen one other man weep before, her father, and it had not been like this. She touched him, but he did not stop. Her own tears fell on his dirty, uncombed hair. She tried to hold him, but for a long while he would not be held. His body was like iron. She could find no softness in it. She sat curled like a frightened child on the edge of the bed, her hand on his back, waiting for the storm to pass over. It was then that she decided not to tell him yet about the child. By and by he called her name, and then he turned, and she held him against her breast while he sighed and shook. He fell asleep at last, clinging to her as though he were going down into the water for the first time. And it was the last time. That night he cut his wrist with his razors, and he was found in the morning by his landlady, his eyes staring upward with no light, dead among the scarlet sheets. And now they were singing, "Somebody needs you, Lord, come by here." At her back, above her, she heard Gabriel's voice. He had risen and was helping the others to pray through. She wondered if John was still on his knees or had risen with the child's impatience and was staring around the church. There was a stiffness in him that would be hard to break, but that nevertheless would one day surely be broken, as hers had been and Richard's. There was no escape for anyone. God was everywhere, terrible, the living God, and so high, the song said, you couldn't get over him. So low, you couldn't get under him. So wide, you couldn't get around him, but must come in at the door. And she knew today that door, a living, wrathful gate. She knew through what fires the soul must crawl, and with what weeping one passed over. Men spoke of how the heart broke up, but never spoke of how the soul hung speechless in the pause, the void, the terror between the living and the dead. How all garments rent and cast aside, the naked soul passed over the very mouth of hell. Once there was no turning back. Once there, the soul remembered, though the heart sometimes forgot, for the world called to the heart, which stammered to reply life and love and revelry, and most falsely hope called the forgetful the human heart. Only the soul, obsessed with the journey it had made and had still to make, pursued its mysterious and dreadful end, and carried heavy with weeping and bitterness the heart along. And therefore there was war in heaven and weeping before the throne, the heart chained to the soul, and the soul imprisoned within the flesh. A weeping and confusion and a weight unendurable filled all the earth. Only the love of God could establish order in this chaos. To him the soul must turn to be delivered. But what a turning! How could she fail to pray that he would have mercy on her son and spare him the sin-born anguish of his father and his mother, and that his heart might know a little joy before the long bitterness descended? Yet she knew that her weeping and her prayers were in vain. What was coming would surely come. Nothing could stop it. She had tried once to protect someone and had only hurled him into prison. And she thought tonight, as she had thought so often, that it might have been better, after all, to have done what she had first determined in her heart to do, to have given her son away to strangers who might have loved him more than Gabriel had ever loved him. She had believed him when he had said that God had sent him to her for a sign. He had said that he would cherish her until the grave, and that he would love her nameless son as though he were his son, as he were his own flesh. And he had kept the letter of his promise. He had fed him and clothed him and taught him the Bible. She had believed, had given her away to strangers who might have loved him more than Gabriel had ever loved him. She had believed him when he said that God had sent him to her for a sign. He had said that he would cherish her until the grave, and that he would love her nameless son as though he were his own flesh. And he had kept the letter of his promise. He had fed him and clothed him and taught him the Bible, but the Spirit was not there. And he cherished her, only because she was the mother of his son, Roy. All of this she had through the painful years divined. He certainly did not know she knew it, and she wondered if he knew it himself. She had met him through Florence, and she had met at work in the middle of the summer, a year after Richard's death. John was then over 6 months. She was very lonely that summer and beaten down. She was living alone with John in a furnished room, even grimmer than the room that had been hers in Madame Williams' apartment. She had, of course, left Madame Williams immediately upon the death of Richard, saying that she had found a sleep-in job in the country. She had been terribly grateful that summer for Madame Williams' indifference. The woman had simply not seemed to see that Elizabeth overnight had become an old woman and was half mad with fear and grief. She wrote her aunt the driest and the briefest and the coldest of notes, not wishing in any way to awaken whatever concern might yet slumber in her breast, telling her the same thing she had told Madame Williams, and telling her not to worry, she was in the hands of God. And she certainly was, through a bitterness that only the hand of God could have laid on her. This same hand brought her through. Florence and Elizabeth worked as cleaning women in a high, vast, stony office building on Wall Street. My foot's hurting. Just from running in the morning. Sit this way. I'm kind of want the sun to hit my face. Hey, Florence and Elizabeth work as cleaning women in a high, vast, stony office building on Wall Street. They arrived in the evening and spent the night going through the great deserted halls and the silent offices with mops and pails and brooms. It was terrible work and Elizabeth hated it, but it was at night and she had taken it joyfully since it meant that she could take care of John herself all day and not have to spend extra money to keep him in a nursery. She worried about him all night long, of course, but at least at night he was sleeping. She could only pray that the house would not burn down, that he would not fall out of bed or in some mysterious way turn on the gas burner. And she had asked the woman next door, who unhappily drank too much, to keep an eye out for him. This woman with whom she sometimes spent an hour or so in the afternoons and her landlady were the only people she saw. She had stopped seeing Richard's friends because for some reason she did not want them to know about Richard's child, and because too, the moment that he was dead, it became immediately apparent on both sides how little they had in common. And she did not seek new people, rather she fled from them. She could not bear in her changed and fallen state to submit herself to the eyes of others. The Elizabeth that she had been was buried away with her lost and silent father, with her aunt in Richard's grave, and Elizabeth she had become she did not recognize, she did not want to know. But one night, when work was ended, Florence invited her to share a cup of coffee in the all-night coffee shop nearby. Elizabeth had, of course, been invited before by other people, the night watchman, for example, but she had always said no. She pleaded the excuse of her baby, whom she must rush home to feed. She was pretending in those days to be a young widow, and she wore a wedding ring. Very shortly, few people asked her, and she achieved the reputation of being stuck up. Florence had scarcely ever spoken to her before she arrived at the merciful unpopularity, but Elizabeth had noticed Florence. But Elizabeth had noticed Florence. She moved in a silent ferocity of dignity, which barely escaped being ludicrous. She was extremely unpopular also, and she had nothing whatever to do with any of the women she worked with. She was, for one thing, a good deal older, and she seemed to have nothing to laugh or gossip about. She came to work and she did her work and left. One could not imagine what she was thinking as she marched so grimly down the halls, her head tied up in a rag, a bucket, and a mop in her hands. Elizabeth thought that she must have once been very rich and had lost her money, and she felt for her, as one fallen woman for another, a certain kinship. A cup of coffee together as day was breaking became in time their habit. They sat together in the coffee shop, which was always empty when they arrived and was crowded 15 minutes later when they left, and had their coffee and donuts before they took the subway uptown. While they had their coffee and on the ride uptown, they talked principally about Florence, how badly people treated her, and how empty her life was now that her husband was dead. He had adored her, she told Elizabeth, and satisfied her every whim, but he had tended to irresponsibility. If she had told him once, she had told him 100 times, "Frank, you better take out life insurance." But he had thought, and wasn't it just like a man that he would live forever? Now here she was, a woman getting along in years, forced to make her living among all the black scum of this wicked city. Elizabeth, a little astonished at the need for confession betrayed by this proud woman, listened nevertheless with great sympathy. She was very grateful for Florence's interest. Florence was so much older and seemed so kind. It was no doubt this Florence's age and kindness that led Elizabeth with no premeditation to take Florence into her confidence. Looking back, she found it hard to believe that she could have been so desperate or so childish, though again, on looking back, she was able to see clearly what she then so incoherently felt, how much she needed another human being somewhere who knew the truth about her. Florence had often said how glad she would be to make the acquaintance of little Johnny. She was sure, she said, that any child of Elizabeth's must be a wonderful child. On a Sunday near the end of the summer, Elizabeth dressed him in his best clothes and took him to Florence's house. She was oddly and fearfully depressed that day, and John was not in a good mood. She found herself staring at him darkly as though she were trying to read his future in his face. He would grow big one day, he would talk, and he would ask her questions. What questions would he ask her? What answers would she give? She surely would not be able to lie to him indefinitely about his father, for one day he would be old enough to realize that it was not his father's name he bore. Richard had been a fatherless child. She helplessly, bitterly remembered as she carried John through the busy summer Sunday streets. When one set of folks got tired of me, they sent me down the line. Yes, down the line through poverty, hunger, wandering, cruelty, fear, and trembling to death. As she thought of the boys who had gone to prison, were they there still? Would John be one of the boys one day? These boys now who stood before drugstores, windows, before pool rooms, on every street corner, who whistled after her, whose lean bodies fairly rang, it seemed, with idleness and malice and frustration. How could she hope, alone and in famine as she was, to put herself between him and this so wide and ranging destruction? And then, as though to confirm her and all her dark imaginings, he began, as she reached the subway steps, to whimper and moan and cry. And he kept this up, too, all the way uptown, so that, what with the impossibility of pleasing him that day, no matter what she did, what with his restlessness, weight, and the heat, and the smiling, staring people, and the strange dread that weighed on her so heavily, she was nearly ready to weep by the time she arrived at Florence's door. He, at that moment, to her exasperated relief, became the most cheerful of infants. Florence was wearing a heavy, old-fashioned garment brooch, which, as she opened the door, immediately attracted John's eyes. He began reaching for the brooch and babbling and spitting at Florence as though he had known her all of his short life. Well, said Florence, when you get big enough to really go after the ladies, you're gonna have your hands full, girl. That, said Elizabeth grimly, is the Lord's truth. He keep me so busy now, I don't know half the time if I'm coming or going. Florence, meanwhile, attempted to distract John's attention from the brooch by offering him an orange, but he had seen oranges before. He merely looked at it a moment before letting it fall to the floor. He began again, in his disturbingly fluid fashion, to quarrel about the brooch. He likes you, said Elizabeth finally, calmed a little by watching him. I got about 12 pages left. You must be tired, said Florence, then put him down there, and he dragged one large easy chair to the table so that John could watch them while they ate. I got a letter from my brother the other day, she said, bringing the food to the table. His wife, poor ailing soul, done passed on, he thinking about coming north. You ain't never told me, said Elizabeth with a quick and rather false interest. You had a brother and he coming up here? So we say ain't nothing. I reckon to keep him down home no more. Now Deborah's gone. She sat down opposite Elizabeth. I ain't seen him, she said musingly, for more than 20 years. Then it'll be a great day, Elizabeth smiled, when you two meet again. Florence shook her head and motioned for Elizabeth to start eating. No, she said, we ain't never get along, and I don't reckon he's changed. 20 years is a mighty long time, Elizabeth said. He's bound to have changed some. That man, said Florence, would have to do a whole lot of changing before him and me hit it off. No, she said, paused grimly, sadly. I'm mighty sorry he's coming. I didn't look to see him no more in this world or in the next one either. There's the airplane coming. This was not Elizabeth felt the way a sister ought to talk about her brother, especially to someone who knew him not at all, and who would probably eventually meet him, she asked helplessly. What do he do, your brother? He's some kind of preacher, said Florence. I never heard him. When I was home, he weren't doing nothing but chasing after women and lying in ditches drunk. I hope, laughed Elizabeth, he done changed his ways at least. Folks, said Florence, can change their ways much as they want to, but I don't care how many times you change your ways. What's in you is in you, and it's got to come out. Yes, said Elizabeth thoughtfully, but don't you think, she hesitantly asked, that the Lord can change a person's heart? I done heard it said often enough, said Florence, but I got yet to see it. These N-words running around talking about the Lord done changed their hearts. Ain't nothing happened to them N-words. They got the same old black hearts they was born with. I reckon the Lord done give them those hearts. And honey, the Lord don't give out no second helpings, I'm here to tell you. No, said Elizabeth heavily after a long pause. She turned to look at John, who was grimly destroying the square, tasseled dolies that decorated Florence's easy chair. I reckon that's the truth. Look like it go around once, and that's that. You miss it, and you fixed it for fair. You miss it, and you fixed it for fair. Now you sound, said Florence, mighty sad all of a sudden. What's the matter with you? Nothing, she said. She turned back to the table, then helplessly, and thinking that she must not say too much. I was just thinking about this boy here, what's going to happen to him, how I'm going to raise him in this awful city all by myself. But you ain't fixing, is you? Asked Florence, to stay single all your days. You's a right young girl, and a right pretty girl. I wouldn't be in no hurry if I was you to find a new husband. I don't believe the N-word's been born what knows how to treat a woman right. You got time, honey, so take your time. I ain't, said Elizabeth quietly, got so much time. She could not stop herself, though something warned her to hold her peace. The words poured out. You see this wedding ring? Well, I bought this ring myself. This boy ain't got no daddy. Now she had said it. The words could not be called back, and she felt, as she sat trembling at Florence's table, a reckless pain and relief. Florence stared at her with a pity so intense that it resembled anger. She looked at John and then back at Elizabeth. You poor thing, said Florence, leaning back in her chair, her face still filled with strange, brooding fury. You was had a time, ain't you? I was scared, Elizabeth brought out, shivering, still compelled to speak. I ain't never, said Florence, seen it to fail. Look like ain't no woman born but don't get walked all over by some no-count man. Look like ain't no woman nowhere but ain't been dragged down in this dirty by some man and left there too while he go on about his business. Elizabeth sat at the table, numb, with nothing more to say. What he do? Asked Florence. Finally, run off and leave you? Oh no, cried Elizabeth quickly, and the tears sprang to her eyes. He weren't like that. He died, just like I said. He got in trouble and he died. A long time before this boy was born. She began to weep with the same helplessness with which she had been speaking. Florence rose and came over to Elizabeth, holding Elizabeth's head against her breast. He would never have left me, said Elizabeth, but he died. And now she wept after her long austerity, as though she would never be able to stop. Hush now, said Florence gently. Hush now. You're going to frighten the little fellow. He don't want to see his mama cry, all right? She whispered to John, who had ceased his attempts at destruction, and stared now at the two women. All right, everything is all right. Elizabeth sat up and reached in her handbag for a handkerchief and began to dry her eyes. Yes, said Florence, moving to the window. The menfolk, they die, all right, and it's us women who walk around like the Bible says and mourn. The menfolk, they die, and it's over for them. But we women, we have to keep on living and try to forget what they done to us. Yes, Lord. And she paused. She turned and came back to Elizabeth. Yes, Lord, she repeated. Don't I know? I'm mighty sorry, said Elizabeth, to upset your nice dinner this way. Girl, said Florence, don't you say a word about being sorry or I'll show you to this door. You pick up that boy and sit down there in that easy chair and pull yourself together. I'm going out into the kitchen to make us something cold to drink. You try not to fret, honey. The Lord, he ain't going to let you fall, but so slow. He ain't going to let you fall, but so low. Okay. Then she met Gabriel 2 or 3 weeks later at Florence's house on a Sunday. Nothing Florence had said had prepared her for him. She had expected him to be older than Florence and bald or gray, but he seemed considerably younger than his sister. With all his teeth and hair, there he sat that Sunday in Florence's tiny, fragile parlor, a very rock, it seemed to the eye of her confusion in her so weary land. She remembered that as she mounted the stairs with John's heavy weight in her arms, and as she entered the door, she heard music which became perceptibly fainter as Florence closed the door behind her. John had heard it too and had responded by wriggling and moving his hands in the air, making noises meant, she supposed, to be taken for a song. Use an N-word, all right, she thought with amusement and impatience, for it was someone's gramophone on a lower floor, filling the air with a slow, high, measured wailing of the blues. Gabriel rose, it seemed to her, with a speed and eagerness that were not merely polite. She wondered immediately if Florence had told him about her, and this caused her to stiffen with a tentative anger against Florence and with pride and fear. And when she looked into his eyes, she found there a strange humility and altogether unexpected kindness. She felt the anger go out of her and her defensive pride, but somewhere crouching the fear remained. Then Florence introduced him, saying, Elizabeth, this here's my brother I've been telling you so much about. He's a preacher, honey, so we got to be mighty careful what we talk about when he's around. Then he said with a smile that's barbed and ambiguous in his sister's remark, ain't no need to be afraid of me, sister. I ain't nothing but a poor, weak vessel in the hands of the Lord. You see, said Florence grimly. She took John from his mother's arms. And this here's little Johnny, she said. Shake hands with the preacher, Johnny. But John was staring at the door that held back the music, towards which, with an insistence at once furious and feeble, his hands were still outstretched. He looked questioningly, reproachfully at his mother, who laughed, watching him, and said, Johnny, want to hear some more of that music? He liked to start dancing when he was coming up the stairs. Gabriel laughed and said, circling around Florence to look into John's face, got a man in the Bible, son, who liked music too. He used to play on his harp before the king, and he got to dancing one day before the Lord. You reckon you're going to dance for the Lord one of these days? John looked with a child's impenetrable gravity into the preacher's face, as though he were turning this question over in his mind and would answer when he had thought it out. Gabriel smiled at him, a strange smile, strangely, she thought, loving, and touched him on the crown of the head. He's a mighty fine boy, said Gabriel, with them big eyes. He ought to see everything in the Bible. And they all laughed. Florence moved to deposit John in the easy chair that was his Sunday throne. And Elizabeth found that she was watching Gabriel, unable to find in the man before her the brother whom Florence so despised. They sat down at the table John placed between herself and Florence and opposite Gabriel. So, Elizabeth said with nervous pleasantness, it being necessary, she felt, to say something. You just getting to this big city? It must seem mighty strange to you. His eyes were still on John, whose eyes had not left him. Then he looked again at Elizabeth. She felt that the air between them was beginning to be charged, and she could find no name or reason for the secret excitement that moved in her. It's mighty big, he said, and looks to me and sounds to me like the devil's working every day. This was in reference to the music reference to the music. This was in reference to the music. This was in reference to the music that had not ceased, but she felt immediately that it included her. This and something else in Gabriel's eyes made her look down quickly to her plate. He ain't, said Florence briskly, working no harder up here than he worked down home. Them N-words down home, she said to Elizabeth. They think New York ain't nothing but one long Sunday drunk. They don't know somebody better tell them they can get better moonshine right there where there is than they likely to hear, and cheaper. So she's just saying they could get it from whatever. She's talking about people who go to New York, I guess, and what they do. But I do hope, she said with a smile, that you ain't taking to drinking moonshine, sister. It wasn't never me, she said promptly. Had that habit. Don't know, he persisted, still smiling, still looking at Elizabeth. Tell me folks do things up north they wouldn't think about doing down home. Folks got their dirt to do, said Florence. They going to do it no matter where they folks is. Folks do lots of things down home they don't want nobody to know about. It seems like that guy likes to tell people what to do a lot, but you know what I mean? He has all that scandalous shit behind him. You know, it's kind of weird. There's people looking at me over there. They're a young couple. I think people need to learn who they are first. I think people shouldn't get in relationships. Definitely not till they're older. But some people are different. You can't really tell people what they are and what they're not, you know? Some stories are very fucking, what do they call those people? Oxymorons, or what's the word? An anomaly, you know? Some situations are just like, they're anomalies, you know? Some couples get together in high school and stay together forever. Like my aunt used to say, Elizabeth said, smiling timidly, she used to say, folks sure better not do in the dark what they scared to look at in the light. She had meant it as a kind of joke, but the words were not out of her mouth before she longed for the power to call them back. They rang in her own ears like a confession. That's the Lord's truth, he said after the briefest pause. Does he really believe that? She forced herself to look up at him, and he felt at that moment the intensity of the attention that Florence fixed on her, as though she were trying to shout a warning. She knew that it was something in Gabriel's voice that had caused Florence suddenly to be so wary and so tense. But she did not drop her eyes from Gabriel's eyes. She answered him, yes, that's the way I want to live. And the Lord's going to bless you, he said, and open up the windows of heaven for you and that boy. He's going to pour down blessings on you till you won't know where to put them. You mark my words. Yes, said Florence mildly, you mark his words. But neither of them looked at her. It came into Elizabeth's mind, filling her mind, all things work together for good to them that love the Lord. She tried to obliterate this burning phrase and what it made her feel. What it made her feel for the first time since the death of Richard was hope. His voice had made her feel that she was not altogether cast down, that God might raise her again in honor. His eyes had made her know that she could be again, this time in honor, a woman. That from what seemed to be a great cloudy distance, he smiled at her and she smiled. The distant gramophone stuck now suddenly on a grinding, wailing, sardonic trumpet note. This blind, ugly crying swelled the moment and filled the room. She looked down at John. A hand somewhere struck the gramophone arm and sent the silver needle on its way through the whirling black grooves, like something bobbing anchorless in the middle of the sea. Bobbing anchorless in the middle of the sea. Oh yeah, the record player went up and down. Johnny's done fell asleep, she said. She who had descended with such joy and pain had begun her upward climb, upward with their baby, on the steep, steep side of the mountain. She felt a great commotion in the air around her, a great excitement, muted, waiting on the Lord. And the air seemed to tremble as before a storm. A light seemed to hang just above all around them, about to burst into revelation, to the great crying, the great singing all around her, and the wind that gathered to fill the church. She did not hear her husband, and she thought of John as sitting silent now and sleepy, far in the back of the church, watching with that wonder and that terror in his eyes. She did not raise her head. She wished to tarry yet a little longer, that God might speak to her. It had been before this very altar that she had come to kneel so many years ago to be forgiven. When the fall came and the air was dry and sharp and the wind high, she was always with Gabriel. Florence did not approve of this, and Florence said so often, but she never said more than this for the reason Elizabeth decided that she had no evil to report. It was only that she was not fond of her brother, but even had Florence been able to find a language unmistakable in which to convey her prophecies, Elizabeth could not have heeded her because Gabriel had become her strength. He watched over her and her baby as though it had become his calling. He was very good to John and played with him and bought him things as though John were his own. She knew that his wife had died childless and that he had always wanted a son. He was praying still, he told her, that God would bless him with a son. She thought sometimes, lying on her bed alone and thinking of all his kindness, that perhaps John was that son, that he would grow one day to comfort and bless them both. And she thought how now she would embrace again the faith she had abandoned and walk again in the light from which with Richard she had so far fled. Sometimes thinking of Gabriel, she remembered Richard. Or sometimes thinking of Gabriel, she remembered Richard, her baby's father, who killed himself. His voice, his breath, his arms with a terrible pain. And she felt herself shrinking from Gabriel's anticipated touch. But this shrinking she would not countenance. She told herself that it was foolish and sinful to look backward when her safety lay before her like a hiding place honed in the side of the mountain. Sister, he asked one night, don't you reckon you ought to give your heart to the Lord? They were in the dark streets walking to church. He asked her this question before, but never in such a tone. She had never before felt so compelling a need to reply. I reckon, she said. If you call on the Lord, he said, he'll lift you up. He'll give you your heart's desire. I'm a witness, he said, and smiled at her. You call on the Lord, you will on the Lord, he'll answer. God's promises don't ever fail. Her arm was in his, and she felt him trembling with his passion. Till you come, she said in a low, trembling voice. I didn't ever really hardly go to church at all, Reverend. Looked like I couldn't see my way in nohow. I was all bowed down with shame and sin. She could hardly bring the last words out, and as she spoke, tears were in her eyes. She had told him that John was nameless, and she had tried to tell him something of her suffering too. In those days she had seemed to understand, and he had not stood in judgment on her. When had he so greatly changed? Or was it that he had not changed, but that her eyes had opened through the pain he had caused her? Well, he said, I done come, and it was the hand of the Lord what sent me. He brought us together for a sign. You fall on your knees and see. If that ain't so, you fall down and ask him to speak to you tonight. So, not to make a joke out of it, it sounds pretty nice, you know. But unless he's gonna be with this lady, but if he cheats on her again, he just has a problem. And not only that, he keeps trying to save people, but he gotta save himself. You know what I'm saying? But I think it's gonna end good, I would assume. I think I have a couple more pages for this last chapter of part 2. I think it's the last chapter in part 2. Yes, a sign, she thought, a sign of his mercy, a sign of his forgiveness. When they reached the church doors, he paused and looked at her and made his promise. Sister Elizabeth, he said, when you go down on your knees tonight, I want you to ask the Lord to speak to your heart and tell you how to answer what I'm going to say. She stood a little below him, one foot lifted to the short stone step that led to the church entrance, and looked up into his face, and looking into his face, which burned in the dim yellow light that hung about them there, like the face of a man who has wrestled with angels and demons. Okay, wait. Like the face of a man who has wrestled with angels and demons and looked on the face of God, it came to her oddly, and all at once that she had become a woman. Sister Elizabeth, he said, the Lord's been speaking to my heart, and I believe it's his will that you and me should be man and wife. And he paused. She said nothing. His eyes moved over her body. I know, he said, trying to smile, and in a lower voice, I'm a lot older than you, but that don't make no difference. I'm a mighty strong man, yet I done been down the line, Sister Elizabeth, and maybe I can keep you from making some of my mistakes, bless the Lord. Maybe I can help keep your foot from stumbling again, girl, for as long as we's in this world. Still she waited. And I love you, he said, and I'll honor you, and I'll love you, and I'll honor you until the day God calls me home. Slow tears rose to her eyes of joy for what she had come to, of anguish for the road that had brought her here. And I'll love your son, your little boy, he said at last, just like he was my own. He will never have to fret or worry about nothing. He will never be cold or hungry as long as I'm alive and I got my 2 hands to work with. I swear this before my God, he said, because he done given me back something I thought was lost. Yes, she thought, a sign that he is mighty to save. Then she moved and stood on the short step next to him before the doors. Sister Elizabeth, he said, and she would carry to the grave the memory of his grace and humility at that moment. Will you pray? Yes, she said, I've been praying. I'm going to pray. They had entered this church, these doors, and when the pastor made the altar call, she rose while she heard them praising God and walked down. And she heard them praising God and walked down the long church aisle, down this aisle to this altar before this golden cross, to these tears and to this battle. Will the battle end one day? When she rose And as they walked once more through the streets, he had called her God's daughter, handmaiden to God's minister. He had kissed her on the brow with tears and said that God had brought them together to be each other's deliverance. And she had wept in her great joy that the hand of God had changed her life, had lifted her up and set her on solid rock alone. She thought of that far-off day when John had come into the world, that moment, the beginning of her life and death. Down she had gone that day alone, a heaviness intolerable at her wrist, or at her waist, a secret in her loins, down into the darkness, weeping and groaning and cursing God. How long she had bled and sweated and cried, no language on earth could tell. How long she had crawled through darkness, she would never know. There her beginning, and she fought through darkness still, toward that moment when she would make her peace with God, when she would hear him speak and he would wipe all the tears from her eyes. As in that other darkness after eternity, she had heard John cry. As now in the sudden silence, and he would wipe away all her tears from her eyes, as in that other darkness after eternity, she had heard John cry. I think she's talking about when she was having a baby. As now in the sudden silence she heard him cry, not the cry of the child newborn before the common light of the earth, but the cry of the man-child, bestial, before the light that comes down from heaven. She opened her eyes and stood straight up. All of the saints surrounded her. Gabriel stood staring, struck rigid as a pillar in the temple, on the threshing floor, in the center of the crying, singing saints. John lay astonished beneath the power of the Lord. Okay, so they were praying and the baby was right there with her. And that's what happened. But yeah, so they were praying and she was feeling the Holy Spirit. But I don't know about Gabriel, man. But it kind of seems to me he might turn out to be like what's the name of the lady he ended up being with, and she found out that he got that other girl pregnant. Speaking about this, and not in like exact context and exact, caricature, and like kind of summing it up the way it sounds, kind of sounds like a drama, But a lot of these, it's kind of like a book about temptation and lust, and how like even a fucking priest, or not a priest, a pastor ends up fucking getting tired of his wife, and I don't know, just life and situations. Kind of I don't know, but look at my little fro. Oh heck no, But anyway, y'all, that's the end of surprised my phone still has juice on it, but that's the end of part 2, chapter 3. I think that was I'm not sure. I don't think, was it Florence's prayer? But now the next is part 3. I'll give you a little sneak peek. Part 3, the threshing floor. Then said I, woe is me, for I am undone, because I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of all people of unclean lips. And I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips, for mine eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. It almost sounds like either a disciple of Christ that wrote that, or Christ himself. So yeah, I'm on page 227. I have to go all the way to 270. So I have about like, I don't know, what is that, 50 pages. So I'm gonna walk down the hill, charge my phone, probably head to the library and get a new book after I finish this one. Peace, y'all.